A black woman sits in a park, unaware a racist cop's about to arrest her. She's calm, he's cocky, but he doesn't know she's the FBI's deputy director. One mistake could end his career or spark a revolution. What happens when power meets prejudice? The sun barely peeked through the clouds as Dr. Sienna Caldwell sat on a park bench in Westbridge, her dark eyes scanning the pages of a worn policy report. At 50, she carried herself with the quiet strength of someone who'd faced the world's ugliness and won. As deputy director of the FBI, she'd spent decades dismantling corruption, racism, and crime. Yet here, in Riverside Park, she was just a woman in a hoodie, craving a moment of peace before a critical meeting on public safety reforms. The air smelled of damp grass, and the distant hum of morning joggers felt like a balm against the chaos of her job. She adjusted her glasses, underlining a sentence with her pen, lost in thought. But then she felt it, the weight of a stare. Across the park, Officer Derek Montgomery leaned against a tree, his sharp blue eyes narrowing as they locked onto her. At 35, Derek was a man who trusted his gut more than facts, a cop with a badge and a chip on his shoulder. He'd been reprimanded before. Whispers of excessive force, complaints swept under the rug, but he always came out on top. To him, Sienna didn't belong here. A black woman sitting alone, too calm, too poised. It didn't sit right. He muttered to himself, "What's she up to?" and adjusted his belt, the clink of his handcuffs cutting through the quiet. Sienna glanced up, catching his gaze. She'd seen that look before, countless times, in fact. The suspicion, the judgment, the way it hardened into something ugly before words even left his mouth. She sighed, closing her report. She wasn't in the mood for this, not today. But Derek was already moving toward her, his boots crunching the gravel path, his posture stiff with intent. The park's peace shattered as he closed the distance, a storm brewing in his steps. What he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly imagine, was that the woman he was about to confront held more power than he'd ever dreamed of wielding. Instincts over evidence. "Morning," Derek said, his voice clipped, dripping with an edge that wasn't quite politeness. He towered over Sienna, one hand resting on his holster, the other outstretched. "ID, now." Sienna met his gaze, unflinching. "Good morning, officer. May I ask why?" Her tone was even, measured, a calm that unnerved him. She kept her hands visible, resting on the closed report in her lap. She knew the drill, knew how fast this could spiral. Derek bristled. "You look like someone we're after. ID, or we've got a problem." His eyes flicked over her. Hoodie, jeans, no makeup. To him, she didn't fit the park's usual crowd. Too composed, too defiant. "I'm just sitting here," Sienna replied, her voice steady as steel. "Is that a crime?" She reached slowly into her pocket, pulling out her wallet, and handed him her driver's license. Not her FBI badge. Not yet. She wanted to see how far he'd take this. Derek snatched the card, scanning it with a smirk. "Sienna Caldwell, huh? Where you from?" He didn't wait for an answer. "Doesn't matter. You're coming with me. Got some questions." "On what grounds?" Sienna asked, her brow arching slightly. She knew her rights. Hell, she'd spent her career upholding them. But she also knew refusing could escalate this into something uglier. "Don't get smart," Derek snapped, stepping closer. "You fit a description. Black female, mid-40s, acting suspicious. That's enough for me." The lie was flimsy, and he knew it, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. He grabbed her arm, yanking her up from the bench. The report fell to the ground, pages fluttering in the breeze. Sienna's jaw tightened, but she didn't resist. Not yet. "You're making a mistake, officer," she said quietly, her voice carrying a warning he didn't hear. "Yeah? We'll see." Derek pulled out his handcuffs, the metal glinting as he snapped them around her wrists. A small crowd gathered nearby, phones out, recording the scene. Sienna felt their eyes, the humiliation simmering beneath her calm exterior. But she stayed silent, her mind already racing ahead. This wasn't just about her. It was about every black person who'd faced this same indignity. And Derek Montgomery was about to learn the cost of his arrogance, the truth unveiled. The patrol car rumbled toward Westbridge Police Precinct, Derek's knuckles white on the steering wheel. He glanced at Sienna in the rearview mirror, her face unreadable. "What were you really doing out there?" he pressed, his tone thick with suspicion. "Reading," Sienna replied, her voice cool. "You saw the report." Derek scoffed. "A woman like you just reading in a park? Sure." The words hung heavy, laced with the prejudice he didn't bother to hide. Sienna's eyes narrowed, but she said nothing. She dealt with men like him before, small men with big egos, wielding power they didn't deserve. At the precinct, Derek marched her through the bustling main hall, ignoring the curious stares from other officers. He shoved her toward the booking desk, where a young officer fumbled with paperwork. "Caught her acting shady in the park," Derek barked, tossing Sienna's ID onto the counter. The desk officer hesitated, glancing at the ID, then at Sienna. A flicker of recognition crossed his face, quickly masked. Captain's in her office. You'll need to take her there." Derek grunted, grabbing Sienna's arm again. "Let's go." He led her down a corridor, the hum of phones and chatter fading as they approached Captain Angela Richardson's office. Angela, 47, was a no-nonsense woman with sharp eyes and a reputation for fairness. She looked up as Derek knocked and barged in. "Captain, caught this one in the park," Derek started, his voice smug. "Wouldn't cooperate." Angela's gaze shifted to Sienna, and her expression froze. She stood slowly, cutting Derek off. "Officer Montgomery, step outside. Now." Her tone was ice, leaving no room for argument. Derek blinked, confused, but obeyed, closing the door behind him. Angela turned to Sienna, her voice softening. "Doctor Caldwell, I'm so sorry. I had no idea." Sienna raised a hand, silencing her. "It's fine, Captain, but we've got a problem here, and it's bigger than this moment." Angela nodded, her jaw tight. "I know who you are. Deputy Director of the FBI. This is unforgivable." "It's not about me," Sienna said, her eyes blazing with quiet fury. "It's about what he represents. I want this handled, Angela. Properly." Angela exhaled sharply. "It will be. I promise you that." She moved to the door, calling Derek back in. His smugness faltered as he saw the shift in her demeanor. "Release her," Angela ordered. "Now." "What?" Derek stammered, his face paling. "Captain, she—" "Dr. Sienna Caldwell," Angela said, her voice like a whip. "Deputy Director of the FBI. You just arrested one of the most powerful women in law enforcement. Unlock those cuffs." Derek's hands trembled as he fumbled with the keys, the realization crashing over him like a tidal wave. Sienna rubbed her wrists, her gaze piercing him. "Thank you, officer," she said, her calm laced with steel. "We'll be talking soon." Derek swallowed hard, the weight of his mistake sinking in. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Hey, if you're hooked by Sienna's story so far, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, hit that like button, and drop a comment below. Tell me what you think of Derek's arrogance. There's so much more to come, so stick around. The precinct buzzed with tension the next morning as Captain Angela Richardson sat at her desk, the incident report glaring up at her. She'd watched the body cam footage 3 times already, Derek's aggressive tone, Sienna's calm defiance. The moment he'd snapped those cuffs on her wrists, it made her stomach turn. Angela had climbed the ranks through grit and integrity, and this was a stain on everything she stood for. She rubbed her temples, knowing the storm was just beginning. Outside her office, Derek slumped at his desk, replaying the scene in his head. He'd screwed up badly, but he couldn't admit it, not yet. She should have just said who she was, he muttered, deflecting the guilt gnawing at him. He didn't see the looks from his colleagues, the whispers spreading like wildfire. Meanwhile, across town, Maya Thompson sat in her cluttered newsroom office, her laptop open to a grainy video sent anonymously, Sienna's arrest, caught on a bystander's phone. At 38, Maya was a relentless journalist, her career built on exposing injustice. Her dark eyes widened as she recognized Sienna's face. Holy shit, she breathed, fingers flying over the keyboard. This wasn't just a story. It was a bombshell. She hit play again, Derek's voice, barking through her headphones, "ID now!" Sienna's calm response sent chills down her spine. Maya knew what this meant: racial profiling, abuse of power, and a cover-up waiting to unravel. She grabbed her phone, dialing sources. This was going national. Back at the precinct, Angela called Derek into her office. He walked in head high, but his confidence cracked under her stare. "Sit," she said, her voice low. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" "I was doing my job," Derek shot back, his tone defensive. She fit a description. "Stop," Angela snapped. "She's the deputy director of the FBI, Derek. You profiled her, arrested her, and humiliated her, all on camera. This isn't going away." Derek's mouth opened, then closed. The room felt smaller, the air thicker. "I didn't know," he finally mumbled. "That's the problem," Angela said, leaning forward. "You didn't care to know, and now we're all paying for it." Clashes in the room. The review hearing was suffocating, the conference room packed with stern-faced officials, internal affairs, precinct brass, and Sienna herself, sitting at the far end of the table. Her presence was a quiet storm, her tailored suit a stark contrast to the casual clothes she'd worn in the park. Derek sat opposite her, sweat beading on his forehead, his uniform suddenly feeling too tight. Angela opened the session, her voice steady but strained. "This is about Officer Montgomery's actions during Dr. Sienna Caldwell's arrest. We'll review the evidence and decide the consequences." She nodded to an IA officer who played the body cam footage. Derek's barked orders filled the room, Sienna's calm responses cutting through like a blade. The officials shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between Derek and Sienna. "Officer Montgomery," an IA rep began, his tone sharp, "why did you approach Dr. Caldwell?" Derek swallowed. "She matched a suspect description. Black female, mid-40s. She was acting suspicious." "Suspicious how?" the rep pressed. She was too calm," Derek stammered. "Didn't seem right." Sienna's voice cut in, cool and precise. "I was reading a report, officer. Hardly the behavior of a fugitive." Derek flinched, his face reddening. "I was following protocol." "No," Sienna interrupted, leaning forward. "You followed your biases. You saw a black woman and decided I was a threat. That's not protocol. That's prejudice." The room went silent, the weight of her words sinking in. Angela cleared her throat. "Derek, did you have any evidence beyond your gut feeling?" He shook his head, the ground slipping beneath him. "No, Captain." "Then why escalate?" an official asked, his voice cold. "Why arrest her?" "I thought—" Derek stopped. the excuse dying in his throat. He couldn't justify it, not here, not now. Sienna's gaze bored into him, unrelenting, and for the first time, he felt the full force of his mistake. Maya's article hit the web that afternoon, the headline screaming, "Racist Cop Arrests FBI Deputy Director in Shocking Park Incident." The video was embedded, racking up views by the thousands. Westbridge was a powder keg, and Derek had just lit the match. The weight of the verdict. Angela sat alone in her office that night, the final report heavy in her hands. The decision was unanimous. Derek would be terminated, effective immediately. She'd fought for fairness her whole career, but this felt like a gut punch. She liked Derek once, brash, but dedicated. Now he was a cautionary tale. She sighed, signing the order, knowing it was just the start. Derek stood in the precinct parking lot, staring at his patrol car keys. The news was everywhere. His name, his face, his shame. He'd lost everything. His badge, his pride, his future. He clenched his fists, anger warring with regret. "She should have said something," he whispered, but the words rang hollow even to him. Sienna met with Angela the next day, her expression composed but resolute. "Termination's a start," she said, "but it's not enough. This department needs reform, training, oversight, accountability. I'll help you make it happen." Angela nodded, respect shining in her eyes. "I'm in, Dr. Caldwell, whatever it takes." Maya's follow-up piece dropped that evening, detailing Sienna's push for change. Comments flooded in. Outrage, support, calls for justice. The story wasn't over. It was evolving, and Sienna was at its heart, a force no one could ignore. Derek packed his desk under the precinct's dim lights, his movements slow, mechanical. Officers avoided his gaze, the silence deafening. He paused at a photo, him grinning at his academy graduation. That man felt like a stranger now. He tossed it into a box, the glass cracking on impact. Angela watched from her office, her heart heavy but resolute. This was necessary, painful, but necessary. Sienna stood outside, the morning air cool against her skin. She'd faced racism before, on the streets, in the FBI, but this time felt different. It wasn't just about her. It was about the system, the cracks she could finally force open. She dialed her team, her voice firm. "Start drafting the reform proposal. We're not waiting." Derek approached her as she hung up, his face drawn. "Dr. Caldwell, I didn't mean for this." Sienna turned, her eyes steady. "Intent doesn't erase impact, officer. You judged me by my skin, not my actions. Learn from it or don't. That's on you." He nodded, shame swallowing his words, and walked away, a shadow of the man he'd been. Promises in motion. Weeks later, the precinct buzzed with new energy. Angela pinned a flyer to the bulletin board. Mandatory bias training starting next month. Officers grumbled, but she saw the shift. Quiet nods, serious glances. Sienna's influence was undeniable. She'd met with city officials, her proposal gaining traction. Body cams would be audited, de-escalation emphasized. Change was slow, but it was real. Maya's latest article praised the reforms, quoting Sienna, "Justice isn't a title, it's a commitment." The piece went viral, sparking debates nationwide. Sienna read it on her phone, a rare smile tugging at her lips. She wasn't done, not by a long shot. Derek sat in his apartment, the TV droning with news of the changes. He stared at his hands, the weight of his choices pressing down. For the first time, he wondered if he could be more than his mistakes. Steps toward tomorrow. Sienna walked through Riverside Park again, the same bench waiting for her. She sat, opening her report, the sun brighter now. Joggers passed, kids laughed, Life moved on. But she felt the difference, the ripple of what she'd started. Westbridge wasn't perfect, but it was listening. Angela joined her, sitting beside her. "We're making progress," she said, "thanks to you." "It's not just me," Sienna replied. "It's all of us." Derek enrolled in a counseling program that week, his first step toward understanding the biases he'd ignored. Maya kept writing, her pen a weapon for truth. And Sienna? She kept fighting, her resolve unshakable. This was her legacy, not just a title, but a movement. If Sienna's journey moved you, subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. Hit that like button and comment. What should Derek do next? Let's keep the conversation going.